And okay, let me just get this up and running so I can see it on this machine also. And I think we're good to go. So I'm Justin Weiss. I'm a dev manager at Avo, which is a small company in Seattle. And Victor was nice enough to invite me here to talk a little bit about testing in Rails. Of course, testing in Rails is a huge topic, so today I'm going to focus on just one small idea that has made a huge difference in the way I write my tests and the way I write my code. So today I'm going to talk about balanced tests. By balanced tests, I mean I'm going to focus on finding the right amount of each different kind of test to write as you build your Rails apps. Different types of Rails tests are useful for different things. So it's important to keep in mind what you'd use the different kinds of tests for, how many of each kind of test to have, and how to manage the redundancy of testing, say, the same model function in your unit, functional, and integration tests. In Rails, there used to be three kinds of tests: the integration tests, the functional tests, and the unit tests. There are more now, but I still tend to mentally filter tests into two main buckets: integration tests and unit tests. As a side note, there's been kind of a recent debate about whether Rails unit tests are actually unit tests. If you followed the TDD debates between DHH and I guess the entire rest of the Rails community that happened after RailsConf, you probably actually heard a lot about it. But I'm not going to get into that right now. For now, I'm going to consider an integration test to be what Rails calls an integration test, a test that tests a complete user interaction across multiple views and maybe controllers. I'm going to consider everything else to be a unit test, since really their focus is just on a single kind of object at once. Now, integration tests and unit tests each have their advantages and disadvantages. I'll go into those a little bit later. But if you can find the right balance between these different types of tests in your app, you can have better test performance and better test coverage. It'll be easier to improve your test performance later on. And you can use your tests to help you beat procrastination and help you get started building new features more quickly. Does that sound good? Let's get started. When I first started building Rails apps, I had a hard time writing tests. I had a hard time writing tests. I went through phases of only writing unit tests because I came from the Java world, which meant JUnit. Then came Ruby and test unit, and I still had no real concept of integration tests or how to write them or how to use them at that time. Even though I had great test coverage on my model layer, our QA team would still find lots of bugs once the code shipped, and unfortunately our customers would find lots of bugs once the code shipped, and when the code was actually used through the UI. My code worked great in the world I had constructed for it in my unit tests, but it didn't survive its first impact with the real world. When I did test my features end-to-end, I did it all manually by clicking through pages, trying things out, seeing where they broke. That was boring, which meant that I really didn't do it as much as I should have, which meant that bugs made it way further than they should have. This really bothered me, as you might imagine, and not to mention our testers and our actual users. Once I learned about and started writing integration tests, it seemed so much better. I could test my app like I was an actual user. I could test my views and my CSS and the interactions between my different controller actions, and I could be absolutely confident that my code worked the way that I expected it to. The world was great, except, and you might be able to tell where this is going, the test took about an hour to run. It took much, much longer to write the tests as it did to write the actual code behind them. And every time I made a change, I broke a big chunk of them, and I had to rewrite them completely. Clearly, this wasn't the right way either. There were benefits to writing each kind of test, but there were negatives too. There had to be a better way. So I took some time to revisit my development process and explore where each kind of test worked particularly well. Was there a way that I could use the good parts of one kind of test to balance out the bad parts of another? So this is what they call the testing pyramid. I mean, it looks kind of like a pyramid. The idea of the testing pyramid is that you should have a small amount of integration or feature tests or acceptance tests, a larger amount of service layer tests, which is kind of what Rails controller tests can be depending on what your controllers are like, and a large amount of unit tests. That is, for a single feature, you could have just a few integration tests, which test your high-level user interactions. You'd have a bunch of controller tests, which test both the controller actions your feature has to use, edge cases, bad parameters, and other things like that. And you'd have a ton of unit tests, which test everything you'd need to build for your model at a lower level. The testing pyramid is an idea that's been floating around for a while. I think I was originally introduced to the idea through Martin Fowler, but the idea has been really useful for me when it comes to thinking about my tests and where I need more tests or could make do with fewer tests. These are the keys to the testing pyramid in practice. Using these steps, you can apply the testing pyramid to your own Rails apps. First, you use integration tests to test drive a feature, usually just a few integration tests per feature. I'll typically end up with a happy path test and a sad path test. If there's anything particularly complicated about the feature, I might also add an integration test for that too. You'll leave these tests failing for a little while you implement everything else. While you're doing that, you write and use your controller and model tests while you're actually working on the code for the feature. If you like to TDD or BDD your code, you use these tests to fill out the actual code you're writing. If not, you code up the controllers and models, and you test what you need to as model and controller tests. But the general point is, you should end up with a lot more unit tests than you do integration tests. So why should you create a good balance between your test types? It turns out that a good balance gives you a lot of benefits that you might not necessarily expect. In general, unit tests are much faster than integration tests. If you're using the default Rails integration test stack, by which I mean action dispatch integration tests, each of your tests is going through a fake rack adapter, full controllers, views, models, database access, sometimes even hitting something like Redis or Memcache for every single page you're accessing. If you're using something like Capybara WebKit to test your JavaScript, it's even worse. Your test will be many times slower since it's driving a real web browser with JavaScript, AJAX, HTML rendering, and everything else. If you have the dozens of integration tests you need to hit every single edge case, you'd be getting up and grabbing coffee, or I guess sword fighting on the back of chairs or whatever it is that they're doing there, every single time you triggered a test run. You can often get an entire file of unit tests to run in the same amount of time as it takes to run one integration test. So the more testing you can do in your units, the better off you'll be. By testing more things in your units, you'll have faster test runs and less interruption of your flow. Usually, the main reason tests are slow is because they're trying to do too much. Either they're hitting the database too often or making actual network requests, I hope not, but I've seen that before, or writing to the file system, or just doing too much work. Most of the time, your tests don't require these things that are slow. It's just the way that the architecture is set up. When this happens, the best and sometimes the only way to improve your test speed is to mock, stub, or inject dependencies to avoid the parts of your app that are slow. And it's much easier to mock, stub, or inject dependencies in your unit tests than it is in your integration tests. Because in your units, you're interacting with your objects directly. But in your integration tests, everything that you do has to go through the web interface, which makes it a lot harder to get into the parts of the objects that you need to get into to test them. So the more logic you have in your units, the more likely it is that you'll be able to improve your test performance with a few well-placed mocks. How do you get the designs for your apps? Do you have designers, or do the features you write come from your imagination? Do you imagine how the features would look to an actual user? An integration test is the closest thing you have to a user actually using your application. It's a lot easier to convert your vision of a feature to an integration test than it is to a set of units. Think of it this way. If you were going to go straight from a design to unit tests, you'd have to do some data modeling first to figure out which objects you wanted to test. You'd have to think about the interactions between the objects and decide what logic goes on which object from the very beginning. And all these decisions have to be made before you can even write your first batch of tests. But if you go from UI design straight to an integration test, you can build a test safety net before you even start thinking about how you'd implement it. It's then even easier to start developing from the UI down. When you build features from the UI down instead of the model layer up, you can be sure that you're not over-designing your code. You're building exactly what's needed to solve a real user problem. It's also easier to get started building real code this way, because you can pretty much translate your designs directly into a test, and from a test into working code. You have brittle tests if making a real change to your code breaks way more tests than you think it should. You'll spend more time fixing your tests than the feature even calls for. Unfortunately, if this happens too often, it can really poison your feelings on tests and testing. At some point, you can have a legitimate case for not even writing tests. I mean, if your tests only break for invalid reasons, what's the point of all the time that you're investing in them? This is actually a serious problem, and it's turned some people I know off of heavy unit testing, probably for life. But if you only have a few integration tests for a feature, changing that feature will require you to change fewer tests. With well-designed tests, a change to a feature would only make you fix a single integration test and a few unit tests. Where is code coverage hardest to hit? There are two places I can think of right away: edge cases and in the interactions between your objects. I could call them edge cases and edges if I wanted to be confusing. But by edge cases, I mean things like what happens when I somehow get invalid UTF-8 characters into this parameter. And by edges, I mean what happens when these two objects interact. Unit tests are perfect for hitting edge cases. You can write a ton of them really quickly, and they run quickly. But testing the edges or interactions between objects is a lot harder to do with unit tests. You often have to set up an entire system of objects before you can really test those interactions. Integration tests are great for getting this coverage up. Since it's testing the system as a whole, integration tests tend to be really good at filling in the cracks that are hard to get to with your unit tests. And since in my experience, there tends to be a lot more edge cases than there are edges and interactions between objects, it fits naturally with the testing pyramid. So that being said, how do you balance your tests? There's a process that I usually follow when I'm writing new Rails features. This process does a pretty good job of automatically keeping a good balance between the different test types. It just kind of happens. Have you ever sat down in front of your computer after typing Rails new and been completely at a loss how to get started? I usually start feeling a little bit of anxiety build in the back of my neck, and I just stare at the screen for a while, not really knowing what to do. In the worst case, you just hop onto Reddit or Twitter and hope inspiration will eventually come. Maybe it's just me, but that tends to be my experience. The other reason I love this process is that it has the side benefit of helping me get started with new features really quickly. I don't have to have internal debates about where to start, how I should model my objects, which tests I should write first, which migrations I should generate first, and any of that stuff. It just gets me started, and that's usually the hardest part. So when I write a new feature or I start a new app, I start with a really lightweight sketch of what I imagine the feature could look like. I usually do these really high level, usually just pen and paper, boxes and lines. At this point, I consider the interaction to be a lot more important than the visuals because I'm going to be writing tests, and the tests really only test the interactions at this stage. So I'll walk through an example. Let's say I'm working on a bug tracker, and I want to build an interaction for filing a bug. We're still in the early stages, so there's no users or milestones or anything. We just have a title and a description for a bug. So here's a sketch I whipped up. As you can see, I'm not an artist by any means, but the core interaction is there. You can see the index page, and I click File a Bug, and I go to a form. I click Submit, and I go to the show page for the bug I just filed. Pretty straightforward. But the nice thing about a sketch like this is that it's easy to debate, change, and demo with other people before we actually commit to real code. Next, you write a failing integration test that captures that interaction. Try to translate the sketch into code as directly as possible. That way, you don't have to make too many decisions about how things should work. Your test captures your original idea really closely, which means that you don't accidentally diverge from the idea you originally had in mind. For these tests, I actually really like Capybara. I'll use that syntax here because it shows the mapping between code and sketch really, really closely. You can still do these with the default Rails integration tests, but it's a little bit more fiddly. So for the sketch I drew, this is what my test would look like. Can you see how well this matches the sketch? The test reads exactly how I describe the feature to somebody else over the phone. First, you visit the bugs page. Then you click File New Bug. Are you on the new bug forum? Good. Fill in the title and description, and click File Bug, and then so on and so on and so forth. Now, our first goal is to get the first part of this integration test to pass. In order to do this, we need to build the page, which naturally leads you to the controller tests. But actually, the first part of this specific integration test is a little boring. So in the interest of a better example, I'm going to pretend that we already did that part, and I'm going to concentrate on getting the second step of the integration test to pass, the create instead of the index. Other than that, it's exactly the same. So moving on to the controller tests. I'm assuming that we're test driving our code. So the next step is to write a failing controller test. Which page, which controller action do we need to implement to get our integration test to pass? Here, it's the create method. So we'll write a controller action for that. Simple. At this stage, you could also think about some of the edge cases your integration test isn't testing and write some test stubs for those, depending on how hardcore you're getting with your TDDing. If you're following the Rails RESTful controller style, you should at this point be able to think about what kinds of models and model methods you'd need. So you can leave this failing for now and start writing some failing unit tests. This is where you can go a little crazy. Test edge cases, boundaries, happy paths, sad paths, and everything else you can think of. I actually have a lot of fun with this part. With a fast enough unit test suite, or by only running the files that I'm actually currently working on, the time just flies by. To me, this is just it's a little bit like brainstorming. I'm just trying to get possible tests out of my head and into code so that I can make sure that I actually covered everything that I can think of. Unfortunately, you can really only work on one test at a time. And so while you're brainstorming, a big problem is going to be keeping track of all the tests that you haven't yet written. If you're using Rails mini-test style tests, you have the skip method, which can stub out your tests before you start writing them, like I did here. So if I brainstormed an entire library of tests, I could start implementing the first one, and then the rest of them could look like this while I'm working on the first test. In your console output, these will show up as S instead of F. They'll output skipped instead of failed, and they'll be summed up in a different category after your tests finish running. That way, you don't have lots of failures that aren't really failures clogging up your test results. I've also tried just using comments instead of skips, like this, or even just making a list of the tests you want to write on a piece of paper. The problem I had with this is that I'd forget to actually write the tests, and I'd have no feedback that these tests weren't written. Then weeks later, I'd stumble on this list, and I'd realize that there were a bunch of tests that weren't actually there, that I were supposed to be there, and that I assumed were actually there. So when you use the skip method, skipped tests are reported during your test runs, so you can make sure to fill those out before you check in. And if you write a snippet for generating those skip methods from here in Sublime, Atom, TextMate, or whatever text editor you use, skip will be the exact same amount of effort as writing quick comments, so I just suggest doing that. At this point, you can start actually getting your tests to pass by writing the code you've been putting off writing until now. If you're doing TDD, you should go through the entire red-green refactor cycle for your tests here. But still, for the first stage, you're focused on your model tests. Once you have enough of your models built, you can start making your controller tests green, which, if you have your models really well developed and tested, that really shouldn't be too difficult. And hopefully, once you're done with that, your integration test will be one step closer to passing. You'll still have to fix the rest of your integration test. So you'll figure out the next step that needs to pass, start writing the test for that controller action, and so on until the entire integration test passes. At the end, you'll have a ton of unit tests for all the code you wrote, and maybe 1, 2, or 3 integration tests for the feature, which sounds like a pyramid to me. So this seems like a lot of process to go through for developing a feature, but after you go through it a few times, it goes pretty fast. It starts to become a habit. But I really love it because each step leads naturally into the next. No step is all that big or overwhelming, and that keeps me motivated, in flow, and working. And because each step flows into the next, I'm never sitting at my desk trying to decide what I should work on next. So, once again, draw a sketch, translate that sketch into a failing integration test, get the first part of that test to pass by writing a failing controller test, writing some failing unit tests, getting the test to pass, and then repeating to get the entire integration test to pass. When you have a good balance of integration tests and unit tests, you'll have a better chance of ending up with a test suite that runs in a reasonable amount of time. You can use your tests to test drive features. You can appreciate the overlap and the redundancy in your tests because different kinds of tests are good at testing different things. But you also try to reduce that overlap as much as possible so that your tests don't run slow and so that they're less brittle. If you're not doing this already, I'd like you to give it a try in your own project. I think you'll be really happy with what you come up with. But I also like to think of this as an example of why it's so useful to take a step back and think through your process, think about what you're doing and why you're doing it that way. Where you feel pain in your current workflow and why you're feeling that pain. If there's a way that you can hide the drawbacks of one technique with the advantages of another technique that you know, this has been one of the most useful things I've learned in my career. If you can build a sensitivity to your code and your process and be able to tell immediately when something feels wrong or just like it should be easier than it actually is, that feeling will take you really, really far for learning new things. So I'd like to thank you so much for listening to me talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I've actually had a lot of fun. If you want to hear more from me, this is who I am on the internet. As you can see, I'm not too creative with usernames or URLs or Twitter accounts or any of that kind of stuff. I write twice a week, once to my website and once to my email subscribers. That's my email address up there too. Feel free to email me at any time with questions or just to chat about software development in general. I love thinking about, talking about, and debating this stuff, so don't be shy. And finally, if you'll allow me a quick plug, I'm writing a book about learning Rails without getting overwhelmed. I'm almost done with the first draft, and I'm really excited. You can read a little bit more about it at this URL, sign up to hear more about it, and get on my list to receive those weekly emails I mentioned. I'm also going to put these slides in my notes up later on this week, and I'll send Victor the link to share with everyone else. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions, I'd love to hear them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Justin, for being part of our first Hangout.
Yeah, it's been fun. Is everything working okay right now? Or I saw a flash and everything disappeared, so I wasn't sure.
Yes, I think it's working okay now.
All right, good.
Maybe you can put your camera. People want to know you.
Yeah. Can you not see it? Let me fix this.
Okay.
Turn off screen sharing. Okay, there I am. How's that? I can actually leave this other one now. Okay.
Okay.
Cool. So I don't know, did we get any questions or comments or anything like that?
Yes, I want to know from your experience because I'm having some problems with tests. When the app is growing and you have a lot of integration tests, the test suite is lower. It's very, very slow, you know?
Yeah, I definitely know that.
maybe because we are using too much factories, too much capybara. I don't know. What do you think what can you tell us so we can improve the performance of our test suite?
So we've had a lot of this type of issue in our own Rails tests, and one of the ways that, or there's a few ways that we found to improve them. A lot of the time, it's a few tests that are causing a lot of the slowdown, and in that case, you can kind of focus on those. And sometimes they'll be doing things like they'll just be doing a little bit too much, or you might be able to share some. You might be able to have some stuff in your test database that would be able to speed up. Like you wouldn't have to do some of the initial steps, for instance. So if you had some good fixtures that might be able to get you partway through the process in your integration test without having to go through the full process, that can sometimes save some time. I've actually noticed a lot of the same thing with factories, and so we have mostly switched over to using fixtures for a lot of our tests because they tend to be a little bit faster. They can sometimes not be quite as nice to use as factories, but if they're well designed and not just kind of thrown in there because you needed an object this one time that looks like this, they can also be really helpful. Besides that, I've played around a little bit with like mocking out parts of the test that aren't actually related to what I'm trying to do with the test, but are kind of like incidental to the test. So if, for instance, I'm doing something and it's going to hit a server to classify a bit of content into a category or something, and that classification takes long, but it's completely incidental to what I'm trying to do with the rest of the test, I'll sometimes just mock out that that classification part and let the rest of the test run. In which case, it's there's always the opportunity for bugs when you're mocking or stubbing something out, but it's kind of a trade-off that you have to make sometimes. Did that help?
Yes. You said that the unit test can handle all the edge cases.
Mm-hmm.
Have a lot of edge cases. in an integration test, what case do you test if you had a lot of ways to do the same thing or a lot of different responses?
So are you talking about like for the testing edge cases in integration tests or
Yeah.
something? So I usually tend not to test specific small edge cases in integration tests unless it's something like major or, I mean, let's see. It's more like if there's an edge case that we're handling in a super special way, I'll sometimes test it in an integration test. Um, if it's an edge case that happens when lots of different objects or like different pages on the site interact in a certain way, I'll sometimes test it with an integration test. But for edge cases, I kind of see integration tests as focused on the touch points between different objects rather than the objects themselves. So like if an edge case is totally handled within a single controller action, I'll probably just test that edge case in a functional test. Or if it's related to a single model, like an edge case in a single model, then I'll usually just test it in a unit test. Because those really shouldn't be failing differently if they're interacting with other objects, because it's all kind of localized into one.
Okay, finally, can you share us what tools do you use in your work? I mean, for example, RSpec, or do you prefer another one, or do you use Cucumber, Capybara, Selenium, or do you use continuous integration servers? All the test suite that in your experience works for you.
Yeah, so we actually, I mean, I use lots and lots of tools, but I can go over some of the most common ones. So I've used RSpec and Cucumber and things like that in the past. Same thing with Factory Girl and stuff. I've kind of recently settled on just using using Minitest and fixtures and kind of the default Rails testing stack for the most part. I find that it's useful because the tests that I write are a little bit more like classes and methods than they are a special DSL. Which can help because I already know how to put together classes and and refactor classes and methods really easily. Whereas with DSL, I'll sometimes have to look something up, or it's just a little bit. It's like one extra step between translating my thoughts into code. I do use Capybara a lot for our integration tests because I just really like the syntax, and it's one of those where, like I said, it's really easy to translate a description of a feature into a test with Capybara, and so. I definitely really enjoy that. We are currently using Capybara WebKit, which is okay. It's a little flaky sometimes. I kind of want to try out Poltergeist, I think it's called, the one that uses Phantom.js, and see how that would, see if that would help us out a little bit more, but we haven't really gotten to that point. We use Jenkins for continuous integration, which is okay. It's also been a little bit flaky for us, although that's probably just because we don't give it enough hardware to handle the load that we throw at it. But we're interested in trying out something different. It's just we haven't found something for that yet. And then we have some testers that use Selenium to write our regression tests that the developers never really take a look at. So I can't really speak to that all that much. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, Justin, I just want to say thank you for your time and for being part of our group. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. I had a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the presentation, and hopefully everything went smoothly. I couldn't really tell.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks.